the throne hall of the Kythun Dominion had never known silence like this. 100,000 warriors stood assembled in the outer courtyards, their formation broadcast live across every screen in the Empire, waiting for the execution order that would end the life of a single human hostage negotiator. Inside the hall, Emperor Vashtor Ren sat upon a throne carved from a single asteroid, sneering down at the kneeling human before him. Except the human wasn't kneeling anymore. James Okafor rose to his feet, despite 2 guard spears pressed against his back, closed the distance to the throne in 4 unhurried steps, and struck Emperor Vashtor across the face with an open palm. The sound cracked through the hall like a weapon discharge. Every guard in the room drew a blade. Every screen broadcasting to the assembled warriors outside froze on the image of their emperor's stunned expression, one cheek reddening beneath ceremonial paint. Vashtor rose slowly, murder in his eyes, hand already reaching for the ceremonial blade at his hip. Then, outside, in the courtyard broadcast still playing across 100,000 warriors' helmet displays, something happened that made every guard in the throne room freeze where they stood. The warriors were kneeling. Not to their emperor, to the human 9 days earlier. None of this had seemed even remotely conceivable. The Kythun Dominion had conquered 40 worlds through a doctrine as old as the Empire itself. Strength earned obedience, and obedience earned survival. Emperor Vashtor Ren, third of his line, had inherited both the throne and the doctrine, ruling through fear so absolute that no subject, alien or otherwise, had challenged him publicly in over a decade. Humanity's first contact with the Dominion had ended badly. A border skirmish over an uninhabited mining colony escalated into a hostage crisis when Dominion forces captured a human diplomatic vessel, taking its senior negotiator, James Okafor, and 6 crew members prisoner. James wasn't a soldier. He was a labor negotiator by training, recruited into Earth's diplomatic corps precisely because he'd spent 15 years successfully resolving disputes between parties who genuinely hated each other. Euros. Factory strikes, hostile mergers, situations where violence had always seemed like the only remaining option, until James found the option nobody else had considered. Emperor Vashtor had no interest in negotiation. He'd summoned James to the throne hall not to discuss terms, but to execute him publicly. Euros. A demonstration to his own restless nobility, several of whom had begun questioning his fitness to rule, that the emperor still commanded absolute authority over every species foolish enough to test the Dominion's borders. What Vashtor didn't know was that James had spent 9 days as a prisoner learning something about the Dominion that would unmake everything the emperor believed about his own throne. James's cell, deep in the palace's lower levels, wasn't isolated. Dominion guards, curious about the alien prisoner, rotated through shifts near his holding chamber, and James, a Euro trained for decades to find leverage in impossible negotiations, Euros began listening. He learned the guards' names. He learned which ones had families in the outer provinces still recovering from Vashtor's brutal tax reforms. He learned, most importantly, that the emperor's own military commander, a decorated general named Corvith Aldun, had grown quietly disillusioned after Vashtor executed 2 officers for questioning strategy during the border skirmish that had captured James in the first place. "You don't hate your emperor," James said quietly to a young guard named Tessic during a night shift, 3 days into his captivity. "You're afraid of what happens if you stop obeying him." Tessic didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. "Where I'm from," James continued, "we learned that fear and loyalty aren't the same thing. They just look identical from the outside. Euro, until someone finally tests which one you're actually standing on." Tessic said nothing that night. But 3 days later, he would be the first of 100,000 warriors to make a choice that changed everything. James requested, through Tessic, a private audience with General Corvith Aldun. Euros. A request that should have been impossible for a prisoner to make, let alone have granted. It worked because Tessic, quietly, had already begun questioning everything James suggested, and because Corvith himself had grown desperate enough for an alternative to risk hearing out an alien hostage. "You slapped nothing yet," Corvith said, meeting James in a secured chamber, voice edged with suspicion. "Why does my emperor's guard tell me you speak as though you already know how this ends?" "Because I've negotiated with men like Vashtor before," James said. "Not emperors, factory owners, union bosses, men who mistake fear for respect because nobody's ever shown them the difference." He met Corvith's eyes steadily. "You executed 2 officers for questioning strategy. How many more of your warriors do you think are one bad order away from finally asking themselves why they're still kneeling? Corvith said nothing, but the silence carried weight. James recognized from 15 years of reading rooms exactly like this one. I'm not asking you to betray your empire, James said. I'm asking you to consider that an empire built entirely on fear was never actually loyal to begin with. It was just waiting. Corvith left that meeting without agreeing to anything, but he also left without reporting the conversation to his emperor, a Euros, and that silence would prove more dangerous to Vashtor than any army. Emperor Vashtor, growing impatient with a hostage crisis that had dragged on 9 days without producing the swift, decisive execution his nobility expected, ordered James brought before the full assembled forces of Euros. A public spectacle meant to reassert his authority in front of the 100,000 warriors currently questioning, quietly, why their emperor had grown so desperate to prove his own strength. What Vashtor didn't know was that Corvith Aldun, commanding those same assembled warriors, had spent the 3 days since his meeting with James quietly relaying a message through trusted officers a Euros. Not an order to disobey, but a question, the same question James had asked him. Are you kneeling out of loyalty or out of fear? And if you don't know the difference anymore, isn't it worth finding out before your emperor asks you to kill someone for pointing that out? By the time James was dragged into the throne hall, that question had already spread through every rank of the assembled forces, unspoken, unresolved, waiting none of them. Yet knew the question would be answered within the hour, in front of the entire empire. James's slap wasn't recklessness. It was like every calculated risk of his career, a deliberate act designed to force an impossible choice into the open, where it could no longer be avoided. Vashtor, blade half drawn, radiating a fury that promised immediate execution, froze when Corvith's voice cut across the hall. Emperor, look at the courtyard feed. Vashtor turned toward the broadcast screen, and the blade slipped from his fingers. 100,000 warriors, kneeling not in the formal salute owed to their emperor, but in the older, near-forgotten gesture of the Dominion's founding oath of Euros. A posture reserved historically for moments when a soldier chose conscience over command, a gesture Vashtor had believed extinct for 3 generations. They weren't kneeling to James. They were kneeling to the question he'd forced into the open a Euros. The question of whether an empire built entirely on fear deserved the obedience it had always demanded. It was the single most dangerous moment of Vashtor's reign, and he had no army left willing to save him from it. Vashtor's guards, uncertain which authority now commanded their loyalty, made no move to stop Corvith as the general crossed the hall and knelt beside James Aguiros, not in submission but in solidarity, the same gesture rippling across the courtyard broadcast. You slapped an emperor and lived, Corvith said quietly. Do you understand what that means to warriors who have spent their entire lives believing that was impossible? I understand it means your empire was never actually as strong as fear made it look, James said. I'm not here to end your dominion, General. I'm here because 6 of my people are still locked in a cell downstairs, and I'd like them back before your emperor decides today's humiliation was somehow my fault instead of his own making. It was, improbably, the least dramatic demand anyone in the throne hall expected at Euros, and it was exactly what finally broke the tension holding the entire empire's fate in balance. Emperor Vashtor Ren was not executed, exiled, or overthrown that day, facing 100,000 warriors who had, for the first time in Dominion history, publicly demonstrated that their loyalty had limits. He did something his father and grandfather never had. He negotiated. James's crew were released within the hour. A formal treaty followed within the month, establishing the first diplomatic accord between Earth and the Kythun Dominion a Euros. One built, at Corvith's insistence, on terms that acknowledged Dominion warriors as citizens with grievances worth addressing, rather than instruments of fear to be commanded absolutely. Vashtor never fully forgave the humiliation of that day. But he ruled differently afterward, aware for the first time that the throne beneath him had only ever been as stable as the fear holding it up a Euros. And that fear, once questioned, rarely returned to its original shape. James Okafor returned to Earth quietly, declining the hero's welcome Fleet Command wanted to arrange, telling only one interviewer the story of what had actually happened in that throne hall. I didn't slap an emperor to prove humans were strong, he said. I slapped him because I needed 100,000 people to finally ask themselves a question their emperor had spent generations making sure they were too afraid to ask. Turns out, the answer was there the whole time. It just needed somewhere safe to kneel.